Chapter 31. How the Admiral sailed for Española. Chapter 31. How the Admiral sailed for Española and what he saw there. Having sailed 107 leagues eastward along the coast of Cuba, the Admiral reached its eastern end, which he called Alpha and Omega. Wednesday, December 5th, he departed from there for Española, which lay 16 leagues to the east. But on account of certain currents that are found there, he did not reach it until the next day, when he made a port that he named Puerto San Nicolas, because he discovered it on that saint's feast day. This is a very large and good harbor, bordered by many large trees and very deep. However, the land about was rockier than the land they had seen before, BK, and the trees smaller, resembling those of Spain. Among them were small oaks, myrtles, and madronos. Through a plain ran a very peaceful river that emptied into the harbor, which was filled with canoes as large as 15 oar fustas. As the Admiral could not gain speech with those people, he followed the coast northward till he came to a harbor that he named Puerto de la Concepcion, which lies almost due south of a small island that he later named Tortuga and was of the size of the Gran Canary. Perceiving that this island of Bohol was very large, that the land and trees resembled those of Spain, and that the sailors caught in their nets many fish like those of Spain, including soles, skates, salmon, shad, dory, corvinas, sardines, and crabs, he named it Española on Sunday, December 9th. As all were very curious to learn all they could about this island, 3 Christians went into the woods while others were fishing on the beach and came on a group of naked Indians, but these fled from them into the thickest part of the forest, something they could easily do, not being hindered by clothing of any kind. The Christians, who needed an interpreter, ran after them and captured a girl wearing only a gold nose plug. They took her to the ships where the Admiral gave her some trinkets and hawk's bells and sent her ashore unharmed. He ordered 3 Christians and 3 Indians brought from other islands to accompany her to her village. Next day, he sent 9 armed men ashore. After traveling 4 leagues, they came on a village of more than 1,000 huts scattered about in a valley. At sight of the Christians, all the inhabitants abandoned their homes and fled into the woods. At this, the Indian guide from San Salvador ran after them, calling on them to return, saying many good things of the Christians and declaring they come from heaven. In this way, he persuaded the Indians to return, confident and secure. Filled with wonder, they placed their hands on our men's heads as if to honor them, brought them food to eat, and satisfied all their requests. They asked nothing in return, only praying them to stay that night in their village. The Christians did not accept their invitation and returned to the ships with the news that the land was very lovely and abounded in the foods of the Indians, and that the people were lighter skinned and handsomer than those they had seen on other islands, and friendly and courteous in dealing with them. They also reported that the land of gold was farther east. Informed of this, the Admiral immediately set sail from that place, though the wind was contrary. Next Sunday, beating about between Española and Tortuga, they met a solitary Indian in a small canoe and marveled that he could keep it afloat in that rough sea. They hoisted him aboard and carried him to Española, sending him ashore with many gifts. He told the other Indians how well he had been treated and spoke so well of the Christians that soon many of them came to the ship. But they brought nothing of value, except some pieces of gold hanging from their ears and noses. Asked whence they got that gold, they told by signs there was much of it farther south. Next day, a large canoe with 40 Indians came over from the island of Tortuga to the Admiral's anchorage at a time when the cacique, or lord of that harbor of Española, was on the beach with his people trading away a large piece of gold leaf that he had brought. When the cacique's people saw the canoe approaching, they all seated themselves on the ground to show they wished to keep the peace. But most of the Indians in the canoe leapt ashore as if they wanted to fight. The cacique of Española then arose and with threatening words made them turn back. He also splashed water on them and picking pebbles from the beach threw them at the canoe. After those Indians had quietly returned to their canoe, the king took a pebble and placed it in the hand of a servant of the Admiral's. That servant might throw it at the Indians, showing that the Admiral favored the king over them. But as the canoe promptly departed, that servant would not do it. Afterwards, telling of the island to which the Admiral gave the name Tortuga, this cacique declared there was more gold there than in Española. He also said that there was more of it on Babique than anywhere else, and that this island was about 14 days' journey from there. Chapter 32. How the principal king of that island came to the ships, and of the great state in which he came. Tuesday, December 18th. This cacique, who lived about 5 leagues from that place, came at the hour of tierce to the village by the sea. Some seamen who were there, sent by the Admiral to see if the Indians were bringing larger samples of gold, went to advise the Admiral of the cacique's coming.
They reported he had more than 200 attendants and was carried in a litter by 4 men who treated him with great reverence, though he was very young.
Having come to the beach, not far from the ships, he rested a while, then came aboard the admiral's ship with all his people. The admiral tells of this in his journal. Your Highnesses would doubtless think well of the dignity and respect in which they all hold him, though they all go naked. When he came aboard, he found me dining at the table below the stern castle, and quickly came to seat himself beside me. Nor would he let me rise to meet him or get up from the table, but insisted that I should eat. And when he entered below the castle, he signaled with his hand that all his people should remain outside. And they did this with the greatest readiness and respect in the world. And they all seated themselves on the deck, except 2 men of ripe years whom I took to be his counselors and tutors, who sat at his feet. I thought he might like to eat of our food, and ordered that some be brought to him. Of the dishes which were placed before him, he took of each only as much as one would take for a pregestation, and the rest he sent to his people, and they all ate of it. He did the same with the drink, which he only raised to his lips, and then gave to the others all with a wonderful dignity and very few words. And those that he spoke, according to what I could understand, were very weighty and sensible. And those 2 elders looked at him and spoke for him, and with him, with great respect. After dinner, his squire brought a belt like those of Castile in shape, but of different workmanship, which he gave to me, and 2 pieces of worked gold, which were very thin, so that I believe they obtain little gold here, though I think they are very near to where it comes from, and that there is much of it. I saw that a coverlet, which I had over my bed, pleased him, so I gave it to him, together with some very good amber beads, which I had about my neck, and some red shoes, and a bottle of orange water. With these things he was marvelously content. He and his counselors were much troubled, because he understood not me, nor I them. Nevertheless, I understood him to say that if I needed anything, the whole island was at my command. I sent for a portfolio of mine, which I kept as a token, a gold excelente, on which your Highnesses are depicted. And I showed it to him and told him again as yesterday that your Highnesses ruled over the best part of the world, and that there were no greater princes. And I showed him the royal banners and the others with the cross. With this he was much impressed, and said to his counselors what great lords your Highnesses must be, since they had sent me such a great distance from heaven. Many other things were said that I did not understand, except that I clearly perceived he was struck with wonder at everything. Since it was now late, and he wished to go, I sent him ashore in the boat with great honor, and caused numerous Lombard shots to be fired. On landing, he mounted his litter and departed with more than 200 men. A son of his was carried on the shoulders of a very important man. He ordered all the Spaniards who were ashore to be supplied with food, and shown great courtesy. Afterwards, a sailor who met him on the road told me that all the things I had given him were carried in front by a very important man, and that his son did not go with him, but followed a little space behind, with as large a retinue as his father. He also said that a brother of the cacique traveled on foot, accompanied by nearly as many men, and was supported under the arms by 2 principal men. I had given this brother, too, some trifles when he came aboard after his brother. Chapter 33. How the admiral lost his ship on some shoals through the negligence of his sailors, and with the assistance he received from the king of that island.
I continue with the admiral's account. He relates that Monday, December 24th, it was very calm, with only light airs that took him from the Mar de Santo Tomas about a league beyond the Punta Santa. At the end of the first watch, about 11 o'clock, he retired to his cabin, for he had gone 2 days and a night without sleep. Since it was calm, the helmsman turned the tiller over to a grummet, which, says the admiral, I had forbidden throughout the voyage, ordering that wind or no wind, they must never entrust the tiller to boys. But to tell the truth, I felt quite safe from reefs or shoals, for on Sunday, when I sent my boats to the king, they had gone 3.5 leagues east of the Punta Santa, and the sailors had surveyed the whole coast and the reefs, which extend some 3 leagues east-southeast from the Punta Santa, and had charted the course we must take, something that had not been done before on the entire voyage. It pleased our Lord that at midnight, while I lay in bed with the ship in a dead calm and the sea as peaceful as the water in a cup, all went to sleep, leaving the tiller in charge of a boy. So it happened that the swells drove the ship very slowly onto one of those reefs, on which the waves broke with such a noise they could be heard a long league away. Then the boy, feeling the rudder ground and hearing the noise, cried out. Hearing him, I immediately arose, for I recognized before anyone else that we had run aground. Very soon the ship's master, whose watch it was, ran up. I told him and the other sailors to take the boat that the ship was towing and cast an anchor astern. He and many others got into the boat, I meanwhile thinking they were going to do what I had told them. But instead, they rowed away. fleeing in the boat to the caravel which was a half a league distant. Seeing them flee in the boat with the water ebbing and the ship in danger, I quickly had the mast cut away to lighten her as much as possible, to see if we could get her off that reef. But the waters ebbing still farther, the ship would not budge, but began to list. Her new seams opened up, and she filled up with water. Meanwhile, the caravel's boat had come over to help me, and the Nina's people, seeing that the men in the boat were escaping to save their own skins, would not let them aboard, and they had to return to the ship. Seeing no possible way of saving my ship to save the lives of my crew, I left her and went with them to the Nina. Since the wind was from the land and much of the night was already gone, and we knew not our way out of those shoals, I stood by with the caravel until daybreak, when I promptly made for the ship through the reef, having first sent a boat ashore with Diego de Arna of Cordoba, chief constable of the fleet, and Pedro Gutierrez, butler of your Highness's days, to let the king know what had happened, informing him that on my way to visit him, as he had invited me to do the previous Saturday, I had lost my ship on a reef a league and a half from his town. Informed of our misfortune, the king shed tears, and immediately sent all his people in many large canoes to the ship. So they and we began to unload, and in a short time we had cleared the whole deck. So helpful was the king in this affair. Afterwards, he in person, together with his brothers and relations, kept careful watch, both aboard and ashore, to see that all was done properly. And from time to time he sent one of his relatives to tell me not to grieve, that he would give me whatever he had. I assure your Highnesses that nowhere in Castile would better care have been taken of the goods, so that not a shoestring was missing. He caused all our goods to be placed together near the palace, where they remained until the houses that he gave as storehouses had been emptied. He stationed armed men to watch over those goods day and night, and he and all the other natives wept as if our misfortune were their own. They are such an affectionate and generous people, and so tractable, that I assure your Highnesses there are no better people or land in all the world. They love their neighbors as themselves, and their speech is the sweetest and gentlest in the world, and they always speak with a smile. They go about naked, men and women, just as their mothers bore them. But believe me, your Highnesses, they have very good customs, and the king keeps so wonderful a state, and displays such dignity, that it is a pleasure to watch him. And what excellent memories they have, and how curious they are about everything, asking what such and such a thing is, and what is its use.
Chapter 34. How the admiral decided to make a settlement in the place where the king lived, and named it La Navidad. Monday, December 24th, the principal king of that land returned to the admiral's caravel, and with much show of grief offered to give him liberally of all he had, saying he had already given the Christians 3 houses in which to store the ship's goods, and would have given more where they needed. Meanwhile, there came a canoe with Indians from another place, bringing pieces of gold leaf to barter for hawksbells, which they prized above all else. Sailors also came to report that many Indians from other places were coming to the village with gold objects. These they gave in exchange for lace points and other trifles. They offered to bring more gold if the Christians wanted it. The great Cacique, seeing that this pleased the admiral, told him he would have a great deal of it brought from the Chibayo, where most of the gold was found. Before going ashore, he invited the admiral to dine with him on yams and cassava bread, which is their principal food, and he gave the admiral some masks with golden eyes and large ears of gold, and other pretty things that they hang about their necks. He complained to the admiral that the Caribs enslaved his people and carried them away to eat, so he was much comforted when the admiral showed him our weapons and told him he would use them in his defense. And he was much surprised to see our cannon, which terrified the Indians so much that they fell down as if dead when they heard the noise. Having received so many kindnesses and samples of gold from these people, the admiral quite forgot his grief over the loss of the Santa Maria. He reasoned that God had caused this to pass that he might take a settlement there, so that the Christians he left behind might trade and gain information about that country and its inhabitants by learning their language and trading with that village. Thus, when he returned from Castile with reinforcements, the colonists would be able to guide him in settling and subjugating that land. He inclined toward this decision all the more because many of his men offered to stay behind, declaring they would gladly make their homes in that country. Therefore, he resolved to build a fort with the timbers and planking of that ship, of which nothing else remained, all that was useful having been taken out. Next day, Thursday, December 27th, news came that the caravel Pinta was lying in a river at the eastern end of the island. In order to check the truth of this, the Cacique Guacanagarí sent a canoe with some Indians and a Christian, but they returned after traveling 20 leagues down the coast without finding any trace of the Pinta. Therefore, no credence was given to an Indian who claimed to have seen it a few days before. The admiral nevertheless arranged to leave some Christians at that place, for all could see the excellence and wealth of that land. The Indians brought many masks and other objects of gold, telling of many provinces of that island whence came that gold. When the admiral was on the point of departure, he spoke to the king about the Caribs, whom those Indians greatly feared. In order that he might be glad to have the Christians for neighbors, and also to inspire in the Indians fear of our arms, the admiral caused a Lombard shot to be fired through the hull of the Santa Maria. This gave the Cacique a great scare. The admiral also showed him all our other weapons, explaining the offensive use of some and the defensive use of others, and he told him that as he was leaving those arms for his defense, he need have no fear of the Caribs, for the Christians would kill them all. The admiral also told that he was returning to Castile to secure jewels and other gifts for him. The admiral particularly commended to him Diego de Arna, son of that Rodrigo de Arna mentioned above. To him, to Pedro Gutierrez, and to Rodrigo de Escobida, he entrusted the government of the fortress and its garrison of 36 men, together with a great store of trading goods and provisions, arms and artillery, ship's boat, carpenters, caulkers, and other men needed for making a settlement, namely a physician, a tailor, a gunner, and the like. He then prepared to steer a course directly for Castile without stopping to discover new lands, for he feared that if anything happened to his one remaining ship, the Catholic sovereigns might never learn of the kingdoms he had gained for them. Chapter 35, How the Admiral Sailed for Castile and Found Pinzon's Caravel. At sunrise on Friday, January 4th, the Admiral left the port that he had named Puerto de la Navidad, because it was on Christmas Day that he had landed there, escaping the perils of the sea, and made a beginning of settlement. He shaped a northwest course, with a ship's boat going ahead to get clear of the reefs and shoals that are there. Those reefs and shoals extend from Cabo Santo to the Cabo de la Sierpe, a distance of 6 leagues and more than 3 leagues out to sea. All this coast runs northwest and southeast, and is beach and level country for a space of 4 leagues inland. Then begin high mountains and many villages larger than those of other islands. He then sailed toward a high mountain, which he named Monte Cristi, that lies 18 leagues east of Cabo Santo. So whoever would go to the town of Navidad, having sighted Monte Cristi, which is round, like a tent and resembles a reef, must put out to sea when 2 leagues distant and sail west till he hits Cabo Santo. Then he will be 5 leagues from the town of Navidad and should enter through some channels among the shoals that lie in front. The admiral thought it well to mention these facts in order to make known the position of the first Christian town founded in the Western world. After they had sailed with contrary winds farther to the east of Monte Cristi, on Sunday morning, January 6th, a caulker sent aloft on the main topsail sighted the Pinta running westward before the wind. Coming up to the admiral, Captain Martin Alonso Pinzon boarded the flagship and began to invent reasons and excuses for having separated from him, saying it had happened unavoidably against his will. The admiral well knew it was not true, being aware of Pinzon's hostility toward him and the insolence he had displayed at various times on the voyage, but he thought it best to pretend to believe him and dissemble everything lest the whole enterprise come to ruin. And this could have happened very easily, since the majority of the admiral's crew were Pinzon's townspeople, and many were his kinsmen. Actually, Pinzon had separated from the admiral at the island of Cuba, with the intent of going to the island of Babique, because some Indians aboard his caravel told him much gold was to be found there. On arrival there, finding these reports to be untrue, he returned to Española, where other Indians reported the presence of much gold. On this voyage, which had taken him 20 days, he had sailed no more than 15 leagues west of Navidad, as far as a little river that the admiral had named Rio de Gracia. There, Martin Alonso tarried 16 days and found much gold, which he obtained in exchange for objects of trifling worth. Half of this gold he had divided among the crew of his caravel in order to gain their consent to his keeping the rest by virtue of his title of captain. Yet he later sought to convince the admiral he knew nothing of this gold. Continuing on his course, the admiral came to anchor at Monte Cristi. As the wind was contrary for sailing, he went in a boat up a river that lies southwest of the mountain, and whose sands abound in gold dust. That is why he named it Rio de Oro. This river lies 16 leagues east of the town of Navidad, and is a little smaller than the river Guadalquivir that runs through Cordoba. Chapter 36. How the first skirmish between the Indians and Christians took place in Samana Bay on the island of Española. Sunday, January 13th, being off Cabo Enamorado. In Samana Bay on the island of Española, the admiral sent ashore a party which encountered some Indians of ferocious aspect, armed with bows and arrows, as if ready for war. Their faces showed anger and surprise, but our men, after striking up a conversation with them, managed to buy 2 of their bows and some arrows. With great difficulty, they prevailed on one to come aboard the caravel to speak with the admiral. Truly, their speech matched their appearance, which was fiercer than that of any other Indian they had seen. The faces of these Indians were stained with charcoal, for all those people have the custom of painting themselves, some black, some red, and others white, some one way and some another. They wore their hair long,
and gathered behind the head into nets of parrot's feathers.
One of them, standing before the admiral as naked as the day his mother bore him, said in a haughty voice that all the people in those parts went about in that manner. The admiral, thinking he was a Carib, and that the bay separated that people from Española, asked him where the Caribs lived. Pointing with his finger, he indicated that they lived farther to the east,
on islands where were found pieces of guanine as large as half the caravel's stern.
He also related that the island of Matanino was inhabited only by women, with whom the Caribs slept at certain times of the year. If these women bore any sons, they gave them to their fathers to raise.
After he had answered all the questions put to him, partly with signs and partly with the help of the Indian interpreters from San Salvador, who knew a little of his speech, the admiral ordered him fed and given some trifles, such as glass beads and pieces of green and red cloth. Then he sent him ashore to induce the others to bring gold, if they had any.
When the ship's boat landed, the Christians encountered 55 Indians among the trees on the beach. These Indians were all naked, wore their hair long, as do the women of Castile, and had plumes of parrot's feathers or feathers of other birds tied to the backs of their heads. The Indian who had visited the ship persuaded the others to lay down their bows and arrows, and the large cudgels which they use as swords, for they have no iron.
The Christians began to buy swords and arrows, as the admiral had instructed them to do. But after the Indians had sold 2 of their bows, they disdainfully refused to sell any more. Instead, they ran toward the place where they had deposited their weapons, with the design of picking them up and also of getting cords with which to tie our men's hands. But the Christians were prepared for their attack, and though only 7 in number, fell upon the Indians with so much spirit that they gave one Indian a slash on the buttocks with a sword, and wounded another in the breast with an arrow. Terrified by the valor of our men and the wounds inflicted by our arms, the Indians turned and fled, leaving behind most of their bows and arrows. Many would certainly have been killed had not the pilot of the caravel, who was in charge of the landing party, restrained our men.
The admiral was not displeased by this incident, for he was convinced these were the Caribs whom the other Indians feared so greatly, or if not Caribs, at least their neighbors. Their appearance, arms, and actions showed them to be a daring and courageous people. The admiral hoped that when the islanders learned what 7 Spaniards had done against 55 ferocious Indians, they would feel more respect for the men left behind in the town of Navidad and would not dare annoy them. Later that afternoon, the Indians made bonfires on the beach to demonstrate their courage, and a boat was sent to see what they wanted. But nothing our men could do would make the Indians show their faces, so the boat returned. Their bows are made of a yew, and are as large as English and French bows. Their arrows are stems of cane, very strong and straight, about an arm and a half long. The arrowhead is a small, fire-hardened piece of wood, about 12 inches long. In this head they insert a fish tooth or bone and coat it with poison. That is why the admiral named this bay, which the Indians called Samana, Golfo de las Flechas. Up country, the Christians saw much fine cotton and chili, which is the Indians' pepper and is very hot. In shallow places, there grew much of that weed, which our men had seen in long streamers in the ocean. This caused them to surmise that it grew near the shore, and when ripe, detached itself and was carried by currents a great distance out to sea. Chapter 37. How the admiral departed for Castile and was separated from the Pinta by a great storm.
Wednesday, January 16th, 1493. The weather being fair, the admiral set sail for Castile from the Golfo de las Flechas, now called Samana Bay. By now, both caravels were leaking badly, and it required great toil to keep them afloat. Cape Sant'Elmo, 20 leagues to the northeast, was the last land they saw. Here they saw much weed, like that they had seen before. After running another 20 leagues, they found the sea almost covered with small tunnies. During the next 2 days, January 19th and 20th, they saw many more. Later they saw many marine birds. The weed continued moving with the current east to west. They had already observed that the currents carry this weed great distances, but not always in the same direction, for sometimes the currents move one way, and sometimes another. This they observed every day until almost half the ocean lay behind them. Proceeding then ever with fair winds, they made so much headway that in the opinion of the pilots, on February 9th they were south of the Azores. But the admiral said the Azores were still 150 leagues away, and he was right, because they still found much weed which they had not seen when outward bound until they were 263 leagues west of Ferrol. As they sailed on then, with fair weather, the wind began to rise daily, and the sea to run so high that it was all the ships could do to stay alive. The night of Thursday, February 14th, therefore the ships ran whichever way the wind would take them. As the Pinta, commanded by Pinzon, could not take the heavy seas well, she scudded due north before a south wind, while the Admiral kept a northeast course in order to draw near to Spain, which the Pinta could not do because of the darkness, although the Admiral made flares all night. Thus by daybreak they had lost sight of each other, and each was sure the other had gone down. In this plight the Admiral's people gave themselves over to prayers and devotions, making vows and drawing lots to decide who should make a pilgrimage in the name of all to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The lot fell upon the Admiral. Then they drew lots for a pilgrimage to Our Lady of Loreto, and it fell upon a sailor of Santa María de Santoña, named Pedro de la Villa. Now they cast lots to select a third pilgrim who should watch all of one night in the church of Santa Clara de Moguer. The lot fell again upon the Admiral. However, the storm grew still more violent, so all the ship's people made a vow to go barefoot and in their shirts to the first shrine of the Virgin they should encounter to say their prayers. Besides these general vows, many persons made their special vows, for the storm now raged with such fury that the Admiral's ship could hardly keep her head for lack of ballast, so much of her provisions having been consumed. To make up for this lack, they filled all the empty water casks with sea water, which helped some because it made the ship more stable and thus lessened the danger of capsizing. Of this terrible storm the Admiral wrote as follows: I could have endured this storm with less anguish if my life alone had been in danger, not only because I know that I owe my life to the Supreme Creator, but also because at other times I have seen death only a hair's breadth away. What caused me infinite grief and anxiety was the thought that after our Lord had deigned to enlighten me with faith and certainty in this enterprise, and had crowned it with victory, in order that my opponents might be abashed and your highnesses served by me with honor and increase of your high estate, his divine majesty should now seek to hinder this with my death, a fate that I could have borne more easily, did it not also threaten the people I had brought with me on the promise of a prosperous outcome. Seeing themselves so afflicted, these men not only cursed the day they came with me, but also lamented that they had let themselves be influenced by my threats and arguments from turning back, as they had often resolved to do. Then my grief was redoubled when I remembered my 2 sons at school in Cordoba, left friendless in a strange country, before I had done, or at least made known to your highnesses, some service that might dispose you to remember them. And though I comforted myself with the faith that our Lord would not permit a thing which was so much for the exaltation of his church, and which I had brought to completion with so much labor and over so much opposition, to be undone and myself destroyed, on the other hand I reflected that he might wish to humiliate me for my demerits, that I might not enjoy so much glory in this world. Then with my thoughts in this world, I thought upon your highnesses, and considered some means whereby, even were I dead and the ship lost, you might get news of the success of my voyage, that the victory I had gained might not be lost. Therefore I wrote on a parchment, as briefly as the state of things required, how I had discovered those lands, as I had promised to do, the length of the voyage and the route thither, the goodness of the country and the customs of its inhabitants, and how I had left your highnesses vassals in possession of all I had discovered. This writing, folded and sealed, I addressed to your highnesses with a written promise of 1,000 ducats to whoever should deliver it sealed to you. This I did, so that if it should fall into the hands of foreigners, they would be restrained by the reward from divulging the information it contained to others. I straightway had a great 1 barrel brought to me, and having wrapped the writing in a waxed cloth, and put it in a cake or loaf of wax, I dropped it into the barrel, which I made secure with hoops, and cast into the sea. And all thought this was an act of devotion. I still feared the barrel might not reach safety, but as the ships meanwhile were drawing closer to Castile, I placed a similar cask at the head of the stern, so that if the ship sank, it might float on the waves at the mercy of the storm.
Chapter 38. How the Admiral reached the Azores, and the people of the island of Santa Maria seized the ship's boat and its crew.
Running on through this dangerous and terrible storm at sunrise, on Friday, February 15th, one Roy Garcia, from the port of Santonia, sighted land from the Round Top to the east-northeast. The pilots and the sailors believed it was the rock of Sintra in Portugal, but the admiral said it was one of the Azores. Although it was not very distant, the storm prevented them from reaching it that day. Beating about because the wind blew from the east, they lost sight of that island and caught sight of another, about which they ran, struggling with a strong cross-wind and foul weather, and suffering great privations in their vain efforts to make land. Therefore the admiral says in his journal, "In the evening of Saturday, February 16th, I reached one of those islands, but the storm prevented me from learning which one it was. That night I rested a little, for I had not slept since Wednesday, and ever after I was crippled in the legs from always being exposed to cold and water, and from eating little. On Monday morning, after coming to anchor, I learned from the natives that it was Santa María, one of the Azores. They all wondered how I had escaped from that very great tempest which had continued for 15 days in those parts. Learning of the admiral's discovery, these people appeared to rejoice, giving thanks to our Lord, and 3 of them came to the ship with refreshments and greetings from the captain of the island, who was away in town. There was nothing in the vicinity of the anchorage but a hermitage, which those people said was dedicated to the Virgin. Recalling that on Thursday they had taken a vow to march barefoot and in their shirts to the first shrine of the Virgin they should find, the admiral and all his people decided to fulfill that obligation, especially since the captain and his people had shown such regard and compassion for them, and since the island belonged to a king who was a good friend of the Catholic sovereigns of Castile. So the admiral asked those 3 men to go to town and request the chaplain, who had the keys to the shrine, to come and say a mass for them. This those men agreed to do, and they entered the ship's boat, together with half the crew who would be first to perform their vows. After that portion of the crew had returned aboard, the others were to go in their turn. When the ship's people had landed, barefoot, and in their shirts, as they had vowed to do, the captain and many of the townsmen, who were waiting in ambush, fell upon them, made them their prisoners, and seized their boat, thinking that without it the admiral could not escape from their hands." Chapter 39. How the admiral rode out another storm, and finally recovered his boat and its crew. The admiral now began to think that the men who had gone ashore were much delayed, for they had left at daybreak and it was almost noon, and he began to fear that they had suffered some mishap on land or at sea. Since he could not see the hermitage from where he was anchored, he decided to sail his ship behind a point from which the hermitage could be seen. Drawing nearer, he saw many horsemen who dismounted and entered a boat with the aim of coming out and taking the caravel by armed force. The admiral ordered his men to arm themselves and be on guard, but not to give the appearance of preparing to resist, in order that the Portuguese might come closer. When they were quite near, the captain stood up and demanded a safe conduct, which the admiral granted, thinking to lure him aboard and then hold him as hostage for the return of the boat and men that he had so unjustly seized. But the Portuguese would only come within earshot of the admiral, who told the captain that he wondered at his unlawful proceeding and asked why the ship's people were not returning in the boat, since they had gone ashore with a safe conduct in response to offers of help and gifts, and the captain himself had sent messengers to welcome him. He also asked the captain to consider that his actions not only were unfriendly and contrary to the laws of chivalry, but would give serious offense to the King of Portugal, whose subjects received good treatment and every courtesy in the territories of the Catholic sovereigns, his masters, landing and residing there without any safeguards as safely as if they were in Lisbon. He added that their highnesses had given him letters of credence to all the princes and lords and nations of the world, which letters he would show him if he came closer. Since those letters obtained respect and good treatment for him and his people in all other parts, they should meet even better reception in Portugal, whose princes were neighbors and kinsmen of the Catholic sovereigns, the more so as he was their admiral of the ocean sea and viceroy of the Indies that he had lately discovered, in proof of which he was ready to show their letters signed with their royal names and bearing their seals. Then he held up and showed him those letters, and told him he might approach without fear, for by reason of the peace and amity between the Catholic sovereigns and the King of Portugal, he had orders to treat with honor and courtesy all the Portuguese ships he should encounter. The admiral added that even if he persisted in detaining his people, it would not hinder his sailing to Castile, since he had enough men to take the ship to Seville, and even to chastise him as his offense merited, should it prove necessary. Besides, his own king might punish him as being responsible for the outbreak of war between him and the Catholic sovereigns. The captain and his men replied they knew nothing of the king or queen of Castile or their letters, nor did they fear them, but would show him what a power was Portugal. This reply made the admiral wonder if some rupture or discord had arisen between the two countries since his departure, but he answered the captain as tartly as his folly deserved. Finally, as the boat was leaving, the captain stood up and told the admiral to bring the caravel into the harbor, for all that he, the captain, had done was by order of the king, his master. The admiral asked all his people to bear witness to what the captain said, and called out to the captain and his men, swearing he would not set foot from the caravel until he had depopulated that island and captured 200 Portuguese to carry home as prisoners. Then he returned to anchor in the harbor where he first lay, because the wind did not permit him to do anything else. But the next day, the wind rising considerably, and the anchorage being poor, he lost his anchors and had no recourse but to make sail for São Miguel. He had resolved that if he could not anchor there because of the terrible storm that continued to rage, he would lie to at sea, a most dangerous thing because of the boisterous sea and because of his crew, of whom there remained only 3 seamen and some grummets, all the others being landsmen, not counting the Indians who understood nothing of handling sails and riggings. But the admiral himself supplied the places of the missing men, and so the night passed with great toil and peril till daybreak. When observing that São Miguel was not in sight and that the weather had improved somewhat, he decided to bear away for Santa Maria, to see if he could recover his men, anchors, and boat. He reached the island in the afternoon of Thursday, February 21st. Soon after his arrival, a boat came bearing 5 seamen and a notary public who, upon receiving assurance of safety, boarded the caravel. As it was late, they passed the night there. Next day, the Portuguese said they came from the captain, to learn for certain whence the admiral came and if he had a commission from the king of Castile. If he would satisfy them on these points, they would treat him with all honor and respect. What caused this change in their bearing was the realization that they could not capture the admiral or his ship, and that they might be punished for what they had done. The admiral concealed his resentment and thanked them for their courteous offer, adding that since their request conformed to the customs and usages of the sea, he was ready to comply with it. Accordingly, he showed them a general letter of credence from the Catholic sovereigns, directed to all his subjects and other princes. He also showed the commission and mandate made out to him for that voyage. This satisfied the Portuguese, who went ashore and quickly saw to the return of the boat and the captured sailors. From them, the admiral learned that it was reported on the island that the King of Portugal had notified all his subjects to make the admiral prisoner by any means they could. Chapter 40. Now the admiral left the Azores and was driven into Lisbon by a storm. Sunday, February 24th, the admiral left the island of Santa Maria for Castile, in great want of ballast and wood, which bad weather prevented him from taking on, though the wind was fair for his voyage. When they were 100 leagues from the nearest land, a swallow alighted on the ship. They supposed a storm had driven it out to sea. This was soon confirmed, for next day, February 28th, many other swallows and land birds came to the ship. They also saw a whale. On March 3rd, there arose so terrible a tempest that after midnight it split their sails. Finding themselves in such great peril, they made a vow to send a pilgrim, barefoot and in his shirt, to the reverend shrine of the Virgin of La Santa Huelva. They again cast lots as to who should go, and again the lot fell on the admiral as if to show that God found his offerings more acceptable than those of others. Many special vows were also made. So driving on, under bare poles in a terrible sea with high wind and dreadful thunder and lightning, any one of which appeared enough to raise the caravel into the air, they were privileged about midnight by our Lord to sight land. But this presented no less a danger, and in order to avoid being dashed to pieces or entering some place where they could not save themselves, they hoisted a little sail, with which they rowed out the storm till daybreak, when they saw they were near the rock of Sintra, within the limits of the kingdom of Portugal. There the admiral had to enter, which he did to the great astonishment of the natives and mariners of that country, who came running from all directions to behold the wonder of a ship that had escaped so cruel a storm. For they had received advices of many ships going down in recent days near Flanders and in other parts. Entering the estuary of Lisbon on Monday, March 4th, he anchored off Castile, and quickly sent a messenger to the Catholic sovereigns with news of his coming. He also wrote the King of Portugal for permission to anchor off the city, because the place where he lay was unsafe if anyone wished to do him an injury,
as some might seek to do on the pretext that the king himself had ordered it in the belief that thereby the victory won by the crown of Castile might be undone.